Hello, on this beautiful September fall day here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Welcome to our first Positive Link speaker series of this new academic year. And on such an important topic, what inclusive leaders do differently. Our Positive Link speaker series is presented by the Center for Positive Organizations here at the University of Michigan's Stephen M. Ross School of Business. My name is Gretchen Spreitzer, and I'm on the Faculty Advisory Board here at the Center for Positive Organizations. And I'm also a Michigan Ross Associate Dean for Engaged Learning and Professional Development. I'm also a professor in our Management and Organizations group here at Ross. Let me start with a few notes about the technology that we'll be using today. During our event, all attendees are view-only participants, which means you cannot be seen or heard. We've turned off the chat and raise hand features, but questions can be asked throughout the event using the Q&A feature you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We're excited to offer a bit of time at the end of the session for Quinetta to address as many of your questions as possible. We've also enabled live transcription services for our event. This feature can be turned on and off using the Zoom settings again at the bottom of your screen. And lastly, we are recording the event and will post the video on our Center for Positive Organizations website as soon as it is ready. The Center for Positive Organization would like to thank the Sanger Leadership Center, the Tauber Institute for Global Operations, the Samuel Zell and Robert H. Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies, and to Paul and Diane Jones for their long-term sponsorship of our 2022-23 Positive Link speaker series. We would also like to thank our series promotional partners, Ann Arbor Spark, and the Managerial and Organizational Cognition Division of the Academy of Management. All right, I think that's all the background that you need to know for today. So now I'd like to invite Quinetta to please turn on her video so that we can introduce her. Quinetta Robertson completed her doctoral work at the University of Maryland. She earned tenure at Cornell University before becoming an endowed chaired professor at Villanova University. In 2020, she was recruited as a distinguished professor of management and psychology at Michigan State University, right down the road from here. So we're glad to have her now as our neighbor. She was the president of the Academy of Management in 2021. I saw her in beautiful Seattle this summer as she turned over her gavel to the next president of the Academy of Management. For those of you that aren't familiar with that organization, it's the Professional Association for Management Professors from around the world. And we have almost, or more than, I think now, 20,000 members. And Quinetta was elected into that role and did a wonderful job in her 5 years of service on the executive committee. I've always been a fan of Quinetta's work on inclusion, on diversity, justice, social justice, because it's so thoughtful in how it's done, how rigorous it is, and the impact that it's had over time. I asked Quinetta if we could also share a little bit about her as a person, as a human being, so you could get to know the broader sense of who she is. And so I have a few fun facts to share with her that she shared with me, but also some other people that know her well. I learned that Quinetta loves to travel, and she has held visiting professor appointments on 6 continents. So I'm guessing that means Antarctica is the last one to, so I don't know what university is there, but if there's a possibility, Quinetta, I know it's in your future. She's also a level 1 sommelier. So gosh, if we had her here for a visit, she could teach me something about wine. I also learned that Quinetta was a sprinter in college at the University of Delaware, and post-college, she morphed into being a longer distance runner. She told me she enjoyed running half marathons. I don't know about enjoying, but obviously she was very did a great job of running those marathons. But she told me recently that she realized her true passion and strength is in sprinting. And so last fall, she returned to training as a sprinter, and she competed in the Michigan Senior Olympics, where she ran the 50-meter, the 100-meter, and the 200-meter dashes, and earned a gold and 2 silver medals across those 3 races. And she's now qualified to represent our state of Michigan in the National Senior Olympics next summer. So, Quinetta, clearly you're a rock star personally and professionally, and we're so glad to have you here for our Positive Links. I'm really excited for your talk. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome and learn from you today.
Thank you so much, Gretchen, both for the invitation and for the introduction. Thank you, everyone who's here today, who has taken time out of your day to join in this conversation about what inclusive leaders do differently. This topic has been, I would say, a vocation and an avocation for me for almost probably about 20 years now, because we first started hearing about inclusion in the late, probably around the turn of the century. And what's interesting, I was, doing work with companies, and I remember talking about to a company about managing diversity. And they said, no, we have to stop you here. We don't manage diversity, we manage inclusion. And I said, okay, what is that? And my interest was to find out what do we really mean by that? And so I want to dig into that a bit more today, but more so not just into the issue of inclusion itself and the conceptualization, because there's a lot of great work that's out there that talks about that, but more so what inclusive leaders actually do. So if we think about inclusion itself, what inclusive leaders do, if we think about the concept, inclusion and being an inclusive leader from a conceptual standpoint is about meeting different needs of employees, that we all have identity needs and affiliative needs, meaning, we want to feel valued for who we are, for the specific things that we bring to a team or an organization, but we also want to feel connected to others. And because of those needs, which actually drive motivation and behavior in an organization, one of those key drivers is leadership that actually delivers on those feelings of value and building high quality relationships. And what I found a lot is that, it's almost like, there's some selection bias, or maybe I would say, desirability bias, because, if you ask someone if they are an inclusive leader, of course, they're going to say yes, right? Or they're at least striving to inclusion. And I think in our minds, we want to actually deliver on those needs and help meet those needs of employees, particularly as leaders. And so we can, leaders often think about what that means to be inclusive and how they could be inclusive. But as we know, there is sometimes a disconnect, or can be a discrepancy between theory and practice. And so one of the things that I've always kind of been driven by is to understand what is actually done, right? What is happening in terms of inclusive leadership? What are the actions? What are the behaviors? And so over the years, I've done work to ask leaders not only how do they understand inclusion, what does inclusion mean to you, but more so, what do you do to build inclusive cultures? And what's interesting is that my colleagues and I have heard a lot of, the things that we know about inclusive leadership, which is considered to be under the umbrella of relational leadership, right? That as we relate to others, as we build relationships, as we, kind of leverage our interpersonal skills, we understand that that's how inclusive leadership happens. we've heard similar kinds of things about building relationships and making people feel valued. But what's interesting, we've gotten some more perspective on the depth in terms of what leaders actually do. And so I wanted to highlight a couple of things, particularly those things that I found really interesting, because when we think about relational leaders, they often talk about recognizing differences or recognizing the diversity that exists within their team or within their unit, within their organization. And that's true for inclusive leaders. But one of the things we heard that was different for inclusive leaders was that they prioritize the skill differences. So it's not so much about diversity for the sake of diversity, but more so diversity because of the skill set that it brings, the diversity of thought, the diversity of skills, and what that might mean for the performance of the team, the business unit, the organization. The second thing is that relational leaders often talk with a focus on the team or talk about a focus on collaboration. But what we found interesting for inclusive leaders is this focus not just on, again, collaboration for the sake of collaboration, but more so thinking about team skill sets. So not only as individuals bringing something to the team, but thinking about, if I put these certain individuals together with these certain skill sets or these certain competencies, where does the magic happen, right? And so thinking about there in terms of opportunity, thinking about all of the ways that the team's work can improve or grow with a focus on not just diversity as an individual category, but more as this kind of collective or team characteristic. The third thing is we heard that inclusive leaders focus on skill utilization. And particularly, we found this interesting for a number of different reasons, because we don't necessarily hear that in terms of relational leadership, right? Again, relational leadership being this interpersonal connection. But a lot of the leaders who, were committed to creating or building these inclusive cultures focused more on having people using their skills and their competencies consistent with not only the roles that they filled in the team, but the roles they wanted to fill in the team, right? And so, if I think about what I believe my strengths are, well, people may see those differently. And often we see strength or we see certain things in other people, which can be good, but that can also result in a typecasting, if you will. And one of the things we heard inclusive leaders talk about is making sure that the person fit the role, but not only the role that they saw for the leader, but making it a bit more collaborative or making it a bit more in partnership so that they were in the role that they wanted to fill. They also talked about identifying contribution gaps. So making sure that not only everyone had a voice in the team, but everyone had a contribution to the team, that they were hearing or getting input from everyone, but making sure that they were using it, that they were valuing it. And so that was a way to create more of that inclusion, because it wasn't just so much about having all voices at the table, but having all voices be valued equally. And then finally, making sure that there was inclusion or in terms of opportunity and giving everyone not only, again, going back to the fit issue, not giving them the opportunities that I think they should have, but also what they would like. And so those three things we found to be, building on what prior research has said inclusion is and inclusive leadership is, but also distinguishing from this relational leadership. But there was something really interesting that came out. And this was the fourth thing that a lot of the leaders talked about. And they talked about allowing involvement. And I'm going to stress allowing, because that is the language that they use, right? And so a lot of the leaders, when we said, what do you do to build these inclusive environments? They said, I allow everyone to have voice, or I allow everyone to contribute, or my personal favorite, I allow people to be themselves, which is interesting to me, because I do think it's important for people to be their authentic selves at work and to have the opportunity to do so. But how do you allow that, right? And so we wanted to unpack this a bit more. What does this allow mean, right? If we look at allow definitionally, it is about giving permission, right? Or it's about giving space, or it's about giving opportunity, but it's giving, right? And so one of the things we heard, and in talking to other colleagues who do related work, one of the things that emerged is that there seems to be a power dynamic, right? And at least the way these leaders were talking about inclusion. And so it made us think about that role of power in being an inclusive leader, right? If I am allowing someone to do something, does that mean that they do not have the space or the opportunity to do something until I grant that, until I give them permission? And how does that allowing occur? And so one of the things that, from that work that we've done, and we like to kind of, build on ourselves and kind of answer our own questions, but to explore a bit more how inclusive leaders use power. Now, if we think about power, leaders have many sources of power at their disposal. They can, there's the formal kind of job authority, I am in charge, and so therefore I say so. But there are other sources of power, such as, someone's expertise in a certain area. There could be the use of rewards. There could be coercion. There's also the basis of power that comes from having certain information that other people desire or need. And if we look at inclusion, I think that we can see that there's an assumption that despite these varied bases of power, that the power that inclusive leaders, or this is an assumption, that power primarily derives from more interpersonal sources, right? So there's this liking, there's this connection, there's this relationship with the leader, and that's how power, that's the use of power in order to lead inclusively or to create these inclusive environments. And thinking about that as an assumption, I wonder if that's actually true. Again, let's go to what theory says versus what is said in practice. And one of the things, we have done some work to ask employees their perspective on feeling or in working in an inclusive environment, or someone making them feel included. This has particularly been the case. We've done some work over the course of the pandemic, asking, employees to recall a time when your leader made you feel included, and asking them what that leader did. What's interesting is that we didn't necessarily just hear about the interpersonal things, about being connected. We heard things like keeping the employee informed, that the leader was very transparent and shared information and shared it on a continuous basis. We heard things about the leader being intentional in terms of guiding collaboration or facilitating collaboration between people in the team or the business unit. We also heard about coaching, right? That people being able to still have opportunities for development, opportunities for growth, to have the opportunity to kind of learn from the leader, even though a lot of the work was happening in a virtual environment. And so these things, they can speak to connection and they can speak to interpersonal skills, but there also seem to be some other things underlying that, right? And so while there was that aspect of connection and that aspect of interpersonal, which would be reflected of leaders engaging in more supportive behavior, we heard things that seemed more about leading, right? And those things that could be more about directing the team or directing the work of the team. So one of the things that, again, we've done is continues to try to understand what it is that inclusive leaders actually do. And recently, some colleagues of mine, in particular, I have to reference my colleague Jamie Perry at Syracuse, we've over the last few years have interviewed leaders, particularly in the hospitality industry, to really go a bit more in depth about their leadership actions and what they actually do and the behaviors and the challenges of being an inclusive leader. And in interviewing those leaders, one of the things we've heard is that there is this focus on interpersonal skills and building connections with employees, because that's the way they're able to engage employees, to be able to motivate employees. But another thing we heard is what we would consider to be a bit more directive behavior. And so directive behavior in terms of, if we think about, again, the sources of power that a leader may have, there are those ones that are more personal, that are more interpersonal, information-based, that support the employee. But then there are the ones that help to motivate and kind of drive the behavior of the employees. So just to give you some examples of those kinds of some of the things that we heard leaders say. One leader said, and I have a few quotes right here just to give examples. I am structured and I am disciplined, but I also try to empower people to be to kind of be able, so again, people's natural language, to kind of be able to lead in their own way and make decisions. The goal with everything that we do is I want to give people and make sure they have the tools and resources, understanding what the goals are, and they feel like there's no barriers to their success, so that we'll be successful as a group overall. And so we could underscore a couple of things here in terms of employees having what they need to be successful. They understand what the work is, they understand what the goals are, but it's setting them up to be effective in their own space. And so, we could think about, without necessarily getting into what style of leadership there is, there's something about that empowerment of people, right? And so not just making sure that there's that liking and that connection, but there's something a bit more work-based and getting them motivated towards what needs to be done in terms of work processes. Another example, and the leader being very candid with us. I know I also can be very dictatorial sometimes. I think that I can be somewhat, this is what you need to do, these are my opinions, but I think I try to be really supportive of people's strengths and talents and interests, and try to allow a lot of space for people. There's that word again, for people to be autonomous and the things that speak to them and that they sort of naturally gravitate towards in a team. And to also sort of expand the idea of team more than what is necessarily prescribed. And so, thinking about this, and one thing that I found interesting, and that, there's that word allow, but allow in service to creating that space, right? That this leader actually mentioned a lot of space, or creating options for the way that the work can be done. And so I think there's that acknowledgement of diversity of skills, but also utilizing that diversity of skills and doing it in a way that's, supportive, again, supporting employees, but that's going to drive the team's work towards success, both individual and team success. And then third, I am inclusive, They made no bones about being inclusive. I am inclusive and get all the inputs from the team. However, I do make decisions in a decisive way. The most important thing is articulate one single vision that's very clear and also specific for our business and for the team. I also want to make sure everyone speaks to each other, because it's important to be collaborative and share the knowledge of the individual expertise they have. So again, that team focus is there, and being able to, make sure that there's a sense of connection and that everyone, is connected to each other, which I think is important. And for one thing that I want to note is, because if we look at a lot of, I would say what the way inclusion is done in practice, a lot of times tends to be perceptual, right? That if we look at our employee surveys, or if we look at engagement surveys, satisfaction surveys, whatever those things are, there are items which will ask, do you feel included, right? Which is, it's data to understand how people feel. But the question is, depending on where the variability is on there, how do you find out what needs to be done to move the needle, right? And so there's an assumption, it's almost tautological in the way that if someone feels included, then they are included. But that is a very, we could say that's an incomplete picture, because it just provides the subjective view or the perceptual view of whether someone feels included. We could also look at the organization or look at the team to see how included people are. I recently published a paper on an aspect of organizational justice, which, for those who are unfamiliar with the areas, it's basically that says, of course, we should treat employees should be fairly treated in organizations, and it's understanding what are those experiences of fair treatment and also how they influence attitudes and behavior. And we put forth kind of a new dimension of justice, which we call contributive justice, meaning, equity theory says that people should get out what they put in to the work. But what if everyone doesn't have the same opportunity to put in? What if everyone doesn't have the same opportunity to contribute? This is why, and we speculate this is a barrier to inclusion, because going back to one of the earlier things that we heard from leaders is that it's important for everyone to have equal opportunity at contribution. We know that for various reasons, both individual reasons, organizational reasons, people are not going to have the same contributions, right? Some people are more directly tied to the mission critical or the strategic work of an organization, but do they have the opportunity to contribute, regardless of the role or where they are, but they have an opportunity to make a contribution? And so this is important as we think about, inclusive leadership as being supportive and directive, because it's giving everyone to have that opportunity for contribution, but also making that contribution and guiding that contribution in a way that's going to drive the output of the team or the organization. That's actually going to drive the vision, drive the strategy, have impact, and be a meaningful input for the team. So that's one of the things that I want to underscore as we think about, what do inclusive leaders do differently? One of the things that we heard is the do, right? And so they actually take action. But in those actions, that behavior, there are supportive behaviors, but there's also directive behaviors as well. Another thing in that supportive and directive behavior, we heard that not only are inclusive leaders directive, but in that they have direction, right? That their efforts to be inclusive seem to be purposeful. So another question that we wanted to explore as we really unpacked inclusive leadership, the act of inclusive leadership, is why do inclusive leaders use their power in the ways that they do? And, this is somewhat near and dear to my heart, because my background prior to becoming an academic, I was in finance. I was a financial analyst. And, it was about, I worked in a bank, it was the bottom line, right? We would say bottom line me, what's the WIFM, what's in it for me, right? But you get to that bottom line thing. And I think, if we look at what's been done a lot of times in diversity, equity, and in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, there is, and a lot of my work ties to the bottom line, which, that can be financial performance, but sometimes it is quite a leap to say that something an organization does in terms of, inclusive leadership or equitable structures is going to have this financial impact. And so we need to think about more localized outcomes, right? What I'm saying is that the bottom line doesn't always have to be financial, but the bottom line should be some form of impact. And so that's one of the things we explored, again, with another set of leaders to understand what do leaders do in terms of that direction or how they use the power, why they use it. And more so what we found is that what's the leadership, right? When we talk about an inclusive leadership, we spend so much time talking about the inclusion aspect. We sometimes forget about the leadership aspect. And so let's, as leadership is a source of influence to enact a vision or to achieve certain goals, we want to underscore that and get to what the leadership is. And when we think about that practice of inclusion and what is the, what's the why or what's that bottom line, what I hear from a lot of organizations, when I talk to a lot of the organizations that I work with, I do a lot of work with leadership teams, and I think that they expect that I'm going to come in and I'm going to say, you need to have more inclusive work environment so everyone can be happy and motivated and you'll have higher performance, right? I think they expect that that's the linear argument that I'm going to make. But just because of my background and because of the experience that I have in talking to leaders, I actually start with the bottom line story, right? I want to know that I want to talk about what does the end story look like? Who do you want to be at the end of this? Or how do you want the organization to feel? What do you want the culture to be like? And so as I talk to organizational leaders, they often talk about, for example, being an employer of choice, right? They want to be able to have the best and the brightest, to recruit the best and the brightest, to have, kind of their pick of the talent that exists, to have, talented individuals that make up their workforce. And so how do they do that, right? They want to talk about inclusion for getting there. Other companies that I talk to, other organizations talk about being a provider of choice, right? They want to, whatever their product or their services, they want in their space for anyone who is seeking that good to come to them for whatever reason, right? Maybe they serve a need that is not served by anyone else. They've been able to, if they have a niche in terms of that product or service, maybe it's a perceived difference, right? But more so when people are, searching for a good or service, they want consumers, they want clients to come to them. And that's how they think about inclusion, is how do we get there? There are other companies who want to be the investor of choice, right? That if people are, they think about markets, as they think about investor decision making, they think about the valuation of the company, they want people to come to them or at least be overvalued and perceived in some way that investors are willing to pay a premium. All of these completely viable outcomes, right? There's some top line things, there's some market indicators, there's some HR metrics, but there's some kind of impact there, right? And so there's a why, there's an end story. And so what we can do from there is start to back into, how does inclusive leadership facilitate that, right? What do you need to do? We know from situational leadership that there's not a one size fits all approach to leadership, right? That we have to take into consideration aspects of the context, aspects of the situation. Think about, industry, think about what talent is available. There's all of these factors that come into play that are going to dictate what approach is going to be most effective. So as we think about inclusive leadership, we need to think about the types of capabilities that it generates, right? Does it give us the ability to understand market needs and therefore be able to generate higher levels of market access, therefore being a provider of choice? Does it allow us greater operational efficiency or greater operational excellence that's going to be able to create economies of scale, that is going to create, savings that we can pass on to the consumer that allow us to reduce pricing, right? These are the types of, and I'm using my business language, right? I can talk about inclusion and I can talk about an inclusive leadership and what inclusive leaders do. But as we think about that, we need to think about the why. And that's what we actually heard from the leaders that we talked to, particularly the ones that we interviewed, in terms of, what is the benefit of inclusive leadership? Do you do it just for the sake of doing it, to say, I am an inclusive leader? Because some people like to do that. But is there something else? Is there some other outcome that in which they're interested, or something else that they're trying to achieve? And we did hear some of that from those leaders. And so giving you some examples of that and inclusive leadership, or being inclusive as goal directed. One leader said, when I have openings on my team, I get a lot of internal applicants, where others who are not so inclusive have a lot more struggles to get people to apply for those positions. People want to work here. They have different skill sets and they're effective. Engagement scores for my associates are among the highest within the enterprise. And I probably should say, after that was the section, a caveat, where the leader's like, I don't mean to toot my own horn. But one of the things that, in talking about the benefits and what's that impact, or what's that bottom line, this leader talked about being able to be that employer of choice, that there was that kind of attraction value, and that attraction value, being able to get talent, get people, with variety in skills, and getting people who had those competencies that could add value to the team. And as the leader said, those different skill sets, even with those different skill sets, they found that those employees were effective. And so it was about the engagement scores, right? Being able to create these high performing teams, which became the goal for this leader and leaders like this one. Another one said, I think when I started in leadership, I was probably more dogmatic and command and control. But over time, I learned that including the opinions of many and the perspectives of many made for a better overall result and better serving the whole constituents that you're trying to serve. So what I find interesting about that is going back to the power basis, that dogmatic command control, the other C word, coercion, right? Thinking about how there was this more directive kind of approach, but in coming to coming to the other side, right? About being more inclusive and using the variety of opinions and skills and perspectives that were in the team, that this leader saw that there was an overall better result in terms of addressing the needs of stakeholders, and broadly stakeholders that, that they were being tasked to serve. For this, I remember this particular leader and thinking about the context in which they operated. And it was, they had internal customers as well as external customers as well. And so they talked about, there was a matrix kind of organization, and thinking about, how do they measure their effectiveness? There were a number of different metrics, therefore what I found interesting was saying that being able to include these different perspectives and engage in inclusive leadership actually helped them to hit on those metrics, those KPIs, or across the KPIs, right? In a number of different ways, both in terms of serving internal and external stakeholders. The third leader said there's no question. There's connectivity, there's more culture, there's better decisions being made. The company runs better if the leader is inclusive. Nobody shows up at work and says, I have no idea what our firm is trying to do or what our strategy is or how to compete. People also feel they can tell you good news and bad news, so they know what to do, why, and how. And so this one, I think this is probably, it makes us as researchers, particularly inclusion researchers, seeing this for the respondent to list all of these outcomes, right? The connectivity, the better culture, better results and decisions being made. But what I found really interesting is that employees, the leader talked about employees having that line of sight to strategy, which is really important if we go back to employees feeling valued. If I link this again to the literature on organizational justice, there are two types of voice that employees could have. One type of voice is what's considered to be expressive voice, right? Where I ask you for your thoughts, but I then go and do whatever it is I was going to do anyway. But there's some value in people being able to express themselves and just being asked. But the more impactful or the more valuable type of voice is the instrumental voice, where I know that my voice or my input is being used in service to the team, the organization, or to the work. And so that line of sight to strategy, we know from research that it actually helps to increase engagement, but it also helps to increase effort, performance, which is going to, of course, have broader outcomes for the organization. And so it's interesting that there's that work aspect, that employees have a link to strategy or a line of sight to strategy in terms of what they do and how that relates. But then there's also the cultural aspect, which I think is really important, going back to the supportive and directive behaviors, that employees, there is a culture or employees feel a comfort in sharing both good news and bad news, right? There's work on inclusive leadership that suggests that one of the hallmarks, and people talk about inclusive leader characteristics as having a sense of humility, but I would also say we know that there's a sense of vulnerability. And sometimes people have a challenge with that, right? How can I be the leader and be vulnerable? But what we are hearing leaders say is that vulnerability or that humility is more about having a learning orientation, right? That I don't have all the answers, and so I want to seek others' input so that we can get to a better product. But B, understanding that we're not always going to do this right. There are going to be some missteps, and that we can course correct and learn from those missteps, right? That is actually something that we heard from employees in giving examples of inclusive leadership during the pandemic, that if there was some kind of misstep, that, there was this collaborative discussion or this collaborative sense making to understand, to do a postmortem on what worked, what didn't work, what could be done differently, and how will we learn from this? What will we do differently next time? And so I think that blend, or that balance of strategy and culture resulting from inclusive leadership that this leader talked about is really important. And so the do, the what, and the why. So how do we put this all together, right? The original kind of proposition or the question is, what inclusive leaders do differently? It's not, in that is a couple of things. One is what they do. And so there's an action-oriented piece. There's the aspect of what it means to actually, be inclusive, what to do to be inclusive, but also that aspect of leadership, right? How do we lead in this way? And so, I've done a couple of TED Talks, and I realized I was coached up that you've got to give people 3 things, or you've got to be able to specify things that they can take away. And so that's the way I've been coached. And so that's the way that I deliver. But so 3 things. But one, that inclusive leaders take real and intentioned action to develop high quality relationships with employees. This is more about, again, not doing or being inclusive for the sake of inclusion, of saying I'm inclusive, or not just, thinking about being inclusive, because we are all well-intentioned, but to take real and intentioned action, right? And so thinking about how can I put this into practice? If I think about, coaching with leaders and how to do this, because I often get queries about, how do we train our leaders to be more inclusive, or what can we do with them, or coming up, helping to design programs for that. And one of the things is, if we're going to think mindset, the mindset is not so much about how to get leaders to think about being inclusive, but more so getting them to think about how to put it into practice on a consistent basis, right? What do I need to do in order to be more inclusive with my team, or in this meeting, or in this situation? Or how was I not inclusive in a particular situation, and how can I do that differently? And so thinking about, actionable steps, actionable strategies, but also the intention behind it, right? Which we'll get to a little bit more in a second, but being purposeful about it. Second is using reimagined strategies for supporting employees and driving change. I think as we talk about leadership, just in general, regardless of what style or what approach we talk about, that leadership, is a source of influence, that we hope that we do have that influence over employees, that we are able to do something, that's transformational, that actually moves the needle on the current, status or situation of the team, organization, et cetera. But those reimagined strategies, if for other talks that I've given, I'll say it this way, I rarely say the terminology best practice, because we often hear about the practice. We don't hear about what made it best, right? Meaning we don't hear about the context. We don't hear about the challenges. We just hear about the practice itself. Someone says, we have diversity training, and everyone's like, I should have diversity training too, right? We have inclusive, we have a workshop on inclusive leadership. Okay, we should have one too. But that doesn't necessarily say it's going to be effective, right? We need to start thinking about the why, but also the what's going to work for us. What is that context? What are the strategies that are going to be meaningful? And so when I say reimagined strategies, is just moving beyond the, I want to give employees a feeling of connection, or I want them to feel included, but more so thinking about, what do I do as a leader to both support employees and to direct their work in a way that is meaningful and they feel valued, right? That's the tension. Those are both parts that need to be there. And so while I may have the mindset of doing that, I've got to put it into action, and I've got to do it in a way that actually, moves us forward. And so that takes us to the third thing, which is connecting to the work for alignment and impact. That if we are inclusive, just as a standalone thing, it typically doesn't work, right? I see this a lot just in the DEI space in general, because people will say, we're going to do diversity, equity, inclusion, and then we're going to do the work, which they don't necessarily see a connection. And if that is the case, the DEI aspect of it becomes devalued, right? They see it as something that doesn't necessarily relate to the work or relate to the bottom line, or there's no kind of realizable benefit from it. And so we need to be able to think about, again, what's the end story? What's in it for us? How will we be better at the end of this? And that kind of alignment will make sure that it is not performative, that it's not just done to be done or to just check a box, but it really is actually having an impact. And so as we think about what inclusive leaders do differently? I would say to you that, they actually do. They do in a way that is supportive of employees and relates to the work. And also in relating to the work, it actually generates impact and drives to something that's transformational. These are my thoughts on what inclusive leaders do differently, but I'd love to have more conversation about that. I will stop sharing and hopefully we can do some Q&A.
Wonderful, Quinetta. I took so many notes. You provoked so many ideas. And as I look at the number of questions that have been posed, clearly you've piqued the interest of so many people that are on this call. So we do have quite a few questions, so I'll just go ahead and get us started. One person asked a question about what have you seen over time that have moved leaders to want to be more inclusive? Is it something about their own personal development, something that's happening in their environment? Why are leaders wanting to be more inclusive?
Yeah, I think, we know that there are some organizations that have inclusion metrics, right? They say that they expect their leaders to be inclusive. But we also know from research across disciplines, from organizational research, economics research, a lot of times those incentives don't work because people will manage to the metric rather than trying to change what they actually do. So Gretchen, I think you actually hit on it, that one of the things that you find is perspective taking, that those leaders, as they think about their inclusion, or if they think about the experience of inclusion and the effect that it's having on people. I think that's been particularly the case during the pandemic, where we've all experienced our own kind of struggles, and that gets them more to that inclusion by having that that mindset, that perspective taking, because they have more of that kind of growth and learning orientation, and they see how they understand what it means for them and therefore can understand what it means for others.
Yeah, that's great. So another person asked kind of a related question. I'll kind of read it because it's a little complicated.
Okay.
What are your thoughts around and guidance for leaders as they're making the transition to be more inclusive, who are fearful of alienating their faithful few while trying to embody inclusive leadership traits across their broader team? So maybe they had some people they were already being inclusive with, and now they're trying to be more inclusive. How do you deal with those kind of dynamics as you're becoming more of an inclusive leader?
So it's an interesting question, because I find the alienating, right, to be interesting, because in my experience, the alienation doesn't necessarily come from the actions of being more inclusive, but from almost the language of being more inclusive, right? So I will, being candid, I can see when I go to talk to some leaders and they're saying, today we're going to talk to Quinetta, about inclusion, and folks are like, here we go with this inclusion stuff again, right? And so, of course, that's alienating, because they're thinking, I've got to, give these. They start thinking about groups and identities, and giving some people, they think about equity and equality and all of these. It becomes a trigger. But if I think more about inclusion, if I went in and never use that word, if I say, I want to talk about supporting employees and making sure that we use all the perspectives in our team, and talk about, high performing teams and talent, people are all in. And so I think that that's what we have to do in particular. And I would say, to add on to that, thinking about the end product. Again, when I start with the WIFM, right? Here's who I hope we are as a team. Here's who I want us to be. Who do you want us to be? And using all of that and thinking about how inclusion, right, can be used in service to that, it becomes less alienating, because it's not so much about individuals, but it's more about how do we become the best we can be.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So those were a couple questions that are about like becoming more inclusive.
Mhm.
There were some questions that were more specific about your research per se. And one question was about, as you were identifying, how did you identify the inclusive lead? Who were inclusive leaders to be able to interview and be able to study? Did they self-identify? Did their people identify? So it's more almost like a methodological question.
Yeah. No, that's interesting because when we in some of our early studies, we just ask leaders, right? But then we kind of realized under the surface, again, everybody thinks they're inclusive. So we had, whether we're doing something quantitative or qualitative, we ask questions to get insight into how inclusive do they see themselves. Sometimes we have data from their direct reports to see if, there's a match on how inclusive they are. But we try to get some of those kinds of controls or some of those the more individual differences, because I don't think that we can point out people and say, that's an inclusive leader, that's not an inclusive leader, because much of the research shows that, really it's more of a journey or some kind of process. And so, there's not something that's, we can identify to say, if you check these boxes, you can be considered an inclusive leader, but people who are more or less inclusive.
Very helpful. That we were talking before the session about who are some of the people on this call, and we talked, some are practitioners, some are academics, some are students, some are also from outside the US. And so one person was asking, does inclusive leadership look the same cross-culturally?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I'm doing this work outside of the US, I first do my research to find out what's the language the DEI language. I often don't use the word diversity, for example, because it's considered to be a US export. But people will talk about multiculturalism. They'll talk about fairness and equity. They'll talk about, in some countries, inclusion is only it's used to describe people with disabilities. So I think that the spirit or the enactment of creating an environment where people feel connected, supported, a sense of belonging, et cetera, is consistent. Of course, there are cultural differences in the value for that or how much of that already exists. But I think those as a leadership style are relatively consistent.
That's great. Yeah, very helpful. I also mentioned to you that, we do have students on this call, and one person asked the question very appropriately, any tips for how subordinates or those not in formal positions of authority can encourage their leaders to be more inclusive? So kind of the other end of the spectrum.
Okay. So that's really interesting, because typically it's how can I, even though I may not have formal authority, but that has the nuance of leading up. Mm-hmm. And I think that, again, going back to that first question about how to get people to transition from exclusive to inclusive, this perspective taking is about experience, right? That a lot of times leaders aren't necessarily, a lot of leaders think about leading and assume that if I do this, that it's going to have a certain result without understanding what that result is. And so part of the feedback process, I think, to leaders is about talking about experience, right? When this happened in the team, this is what I experienced, or this is what I noticed, or this is what. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend saying to a leader, you need to be more inclusive, but in giving the feedback on, I didn't feel like I could speak up because of this, or I didn't feel like I could. And that will, I think, alert them, because a lot of times leaders just don't think about that, but raising it to their attention makes it more salient. And I think that starts to move the needle to inclusion a bit more.
Wonderful. Hey, I hate to shut down the conversation because it's such a great one. And I'll tell you, there are so many comments that have exclamation points and, people showing a lot of excitement and enthusiasm and wanting to put into practice the things that you're sharing with us today. And I feel that way too. Like, how can I be a more inclusive leader? How can I be a more inclusive teacher? How can I be a more inclusive parent and friend? So you've stimulated a lot of ideas for me. So with that, I'm going to have to close down our conversation today. I want to thank you so much, Quinetta, for sharing your wisdom with us today. I'd like to thank all the attendees for joining us today for this first Positive Links session of the school year. We'll email out more information next week with a link to the video, and our next Positive Links speaker series, Thinking Forward, will be in October, on October 6th, again at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll have Laura Wang from Harvard University talking about her book entitled Edge, Turning Adversity into Advantage. We really hope you can join us. And one more time, thank you so much, Quinetta. We're so glad to get to learn from you today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone for being here. And I've been looking at the questions. So thank you for the question, because now my brain is turning.
Yes, I'm so glad you'll get a chance to look at the rest of them, because they are so helpful and encouraging. People really were intrigued with that idea of allowing. So you'll see a lot of thoughts about that.
Great.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again, everybody. Have a great day.